Thanks everybody for coming out this evening. If it gets, we have two people at the back, Will and Sarah, that are operating the windows. If it gets too hot or too cold, gesture towards them. But thanks for coming out tonight to this event on religion and the left. My name is Antoni. I'm with the hosting student society tonight, the Platypus Affiliated Society, and I'm the head of the chapter just across the street at Dalhousie. I want to thank Reed. Is Reed here? Okay. Thank Reed and the King's Contemporary Studies program for sponsoring tonight's event. This is the first event Platypus has done here at King's. Just a brief introduction to Platypus since we're sort of new here. Our basic purpose is to question the state of the left today in light of its history and what we consider to be its present disintegration. We seek clarification of the left's meaning through discussion, debate, and disagreement like we will have tonight. We do this work primarily at college campuses, and it takes the form of reading groups, film screenings, and informal weekly coffee breaks and panel discussions. Our coffee breaks are a good place to meet up and talk about the left, and if you want to attend one, they're on Tuesdays. We had one today at 5 p.m. at the Second Cup. It's a great place to sort of talk about these things, like the panel, for instance. I'm sure I will go away and have like lots of thoughts and want to talk to somebody, and if you're the same way, come to Second Cup. We also have a weekly reading group that meets on Thursdays at 5 p.m. at the University Club Pub at Dow, over there. The readings are relatively easy, and there's really good discussion, and anybody's welcome. It's really accessible. If you want to know more about our events, there's the Facebook group, and also I have a sign-up sheet. I'll just put over to Mark. If you're already on the list, you don't need to sign in there, obviously. We also bring our project into print and publish this free monthly broadsheet, the Platypus Review, which is very much like the discussion tonight. Various figures on the left sort of publish, we curate 3 articles typically. And you can find it around campus at Princess Hall Dining Room, Covert Coffee, and the King's Library. Right there we have extra copies of the October issue, but we've got the February-March issues just in the process of being shipped out here. So you should see it next week. Just one last plug, we have our 5th annual convention that's coming up in Chicago on April 6th to the 8th. There's a host of international speakers. We have somebody from the Greek political party, Syriza, Quebec Solidaire, and I was really happy this week, Halifax's own Solidarity Halifax is going to be at the convention. So check out our website for more information. Sign-up sheet is going around. We are active on a number of campuses in North America and Europe, but we would love to get started at King's. So if you're interested, there's a little bubble there. Just put your X, and then at the end of term, we'll sort of discuss how to get started here in September. Okay, so tonight's the first event we have in this series, Religion and the Left, which will be held on other campuses, which will allow us to try to understand on an international scale how the left is coming to relate to religion. I think the next event is scheduled for Loyola University in Chicago in mid-April. Now, with all our events, you may strongly agree or disagree with some of the points tonight. You may be here, in fact, to support or dismiss like one of the panelists. What we try to do in Platypus is hold a conversation in which the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So we want to try and sort of like render meaning out of like these disagreements and what they may mean more broadly, what we can sort of pull out of them. And hopefully, if we're successful by the end of the evening, this conversation will roll around in your head for a couple of days. Now, the event will proceed as follows. We'll have 8 to 10 minute opening remarks by each of the speakers. They've been asked to respond to 1 or 2 of these 6 very large questions that have been prepared by the committee within Platypus who put this initiative together. I was not part of this, but a number of students from other campuses have sort of put these questions together. We'll then go to question or remarks from the audience. Hopefully that'll be a lively discussion. And I'll take the questions from the audience or remarks in maybe 2 or 3s depending on how many questions there are. But please try to keep, they don't have to be questions, they can just be observations, but try to keep them to about a minute so we can get around the room and have the panelists respond. We will wrap things up sharp at 9 p.m. tonight, so you know we won't drag it on. I know there's some some of our panelists have, one of our panelists has traveled quite a distance tonight, so we really want to get him home. If there is anyone, if anybody does want to keep talking, we may go, I don't know if the wardroom is open tonight? Yeah, we'll go down to the wardroom and we can just keep going. I do want to extend a big thanks to Mary, Chris, Clement, and Mark for helping sort of think about who the local speakers could be on this panel. So thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to read the description that was prepared by the committee. It goes like this. Religion necessarily appears to the left today as a question of for or against. But religion and the left are by no means transhistorical categories. They change over time. A massive historical divide separates the Abbe Sieyes' conflict with Pope Pius VI in the French Revolution from invading Soviet and Afghan armies, Soviet and American armies conflict with the Afghan mujahideen. At the beginning of the 20th century, socialist politics served as the church of the working class. It was not merely secular, but secularist. Yet, as the working class politics unfolded in defeat and betrayal over the course of the 20th century, the left seemed to drift inexorably to the right. This rightward drift was mirrored in religion, and this seemed to render plausible the antipathies of left-secularists such as Christopher Hitchens. Yet during the same period, ostensibly progressive religious movements gained ground by capturing the socially conscious impulses generated by the absence of working class politics. Religion seemed to claim a monopoly on the ideology of peace and social justice. Increasingly, under neoliberal reforms, religion even came to monopolize the provision of social welfare. The left seemingly overcame its theophobia, found itself going to church in hopes of organizing the working class, dropping its erstwhile secularism in the process. How might the left overcome its current impasses is anybody's guess. An approach towards genuinely reform-minded religionists would seem to offer a means of winning adherents to radical politics without ceding any ground that wasn't already lost to the left decades ago. But while the left may be bankrupt, religion isn't going out of business anytime soon. One is tempted to wonder if the player is not in fact being played. I think the question tonight is, how do we understand these transformations? What do they mean? So I'd like to introduce our panel tonight. I'm very pleased that people were able to make time in their schedule to come out. I think you'll find on this panel there's people with considerable experience, both academic and actual practical politics. Start immediately to my left here. Arthur McCalla is a professor at Mount St. Vincent University who's cross-appointed between the Department of History and Philosophy and Religious Studies. His research program investigates challenges to religious claims to eternal truth posed by the rise of historical mindedness and the ramification of these challenges for modern society. His current research project studies theories of religion and society in the 19th century France. He's also written a book on creationism, in which he argues that creationism is not really about science at all, but instead about the status of the Bible in relation to historical mindedness. Beside Arthur is Gary Burrill. Gary was elected to the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly in 2009 as a member of the New Democratic Party. He's a United Church minister who's been serving in the Upper Musquodoboit since 1990. Prior to entering the ministry, Gary edited New Maritimes, a magazine of regional politics and culture. He has lectured in Atlantic Canada Studies and Maritime Social History and is the author of numerous articles and essays on maritime issues and the book, Away, Maritimers in Massachusetts, Ontario, and Alberta, an oral history of leaving home. Gary received his BA and MA degrees in sociology from Queen's. He also holds a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard University. Beside Gary is Antoni Wysocki. Antoni Wysocki. Thank you. Antoni took part in the Battle of Seattle in 1999 and acted as a human rights monitor in the conflict in Burnt Church, New Brunswick in 2001. He has been a delegate to the governing body of the Green Party of Canada, worked as a political organizer with the Canadian Labour Congress, and he served as a president of his local union. He's also participated in the formation of the Nova Scotia branch of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in 2000, and a year ago he helped create a libertarian communist organization here in Halifax called STAND. And finally, Katie. Katie Toth is a freelance religious journalist and a youth leader for the Edgewood Oxford United Church in Halifax. She spent 4 months living in large Cape Breton, an ecumenical Christian community for people with disabilities. A warm round of applause for our panelists. And we'll just move our way down that way.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks to Antoni, our moderator, for organizing the event, and other committee members who are here. And welcome, panelists. Look forward to hearing from all of you. So I'm going to have to give a bit of historical context for our talk tonight. As you've heard, my area of research is 19th century religious thought in France, and so I'm going to talk about 19th century religious thought in France, maybe a bit of 18th century as well. So as you heard in that summary of the program for the international discussions, religion is not an ahistorical category. This is what I'm going to talk about tonight. Religion has conceptual history. My main point tonight is that the conceptual history of religion is relevant to how we think about our big questions concerning religion and the left. I want to begin with a famous slogan from the French Revolution: strangle the last noble with the guts of the last priest. You're all familiar with that. That is a practical application of a radical enlightenment critique of religion. And in fact, religion preoccupied thinkers of the radical enlightenment. The assumption was, of course, that reason is not only the best approach to understanding the universe and human life, but also the original, the natural approach. Irrationality, they thought, represents both an absence of reason and the loss of something previously possessed. As they looked around society, they identified religion as the most powerful manifestation of irrationality. Religion, they thought, is a matter of credulity and superstition. It transforms people into fanatics, mystics, and cruel zealots. If religion, then, is not natural, not original to humanity, then something must have happened in history to bring it into existence. Because what that something was inspired many Enlightenment treatises on religion. Perhaps natural catastrophes traumatized early humanity, drove them into irrationality by destroying their capacity for rational reflection. Flood was a popular choice for natural catastrophe. Or perhaps a flaw in human psychology predisposed humanity to fall into irrationality. Or perhaps clever fraudsters invented religion as a means of exerting power over the rest of humanity. This is where we get that wonderful concept, priestcraft. Priests are always up to something. Good, radical enlightenment idea. Or perhaps it was a combination of all these reasons. But however it happened, the idea was that religion must somehow have come into being in history. It wasn't original. In all cases, the radical enlightenment thought that the solution, the remedy, the cure for religion was the critical analysis itself. Once religion has been unveiled as an irrational illusion, people would be freed from its tyranny. The tyranny of priests, warping of human life by dogma. In both its materialist rejection of religion and its faith in the emancipatory power of exposing metaphysical illusion, the radical enlightenment was consciously following in the footsteps of ancient Epicureanism. I can mention Epicureanism in the citadel of Platonism, in this case. Epicureanism was a materialist philosophy, as you may know, of both nature and society. It taught the universe is composed of atoms that move through contingent occurrences into greater and greater complexity, while human society, if freed by philosophy from the fear of the gods, will develop in the direction of greater freedom and happiness. So the radical enlightenment critique and identified religion, meaning specifically Roman Catholic Church, as the partner in tyranny of the monarchy. Liberation of tyranny correspondingly called for the destruction of both the religious Catholic Church and the social and political order. And so the French Revolutionaries' de-Christianization campaign was intended to carry out this project, eliminate the deleterious influence of religion on society. So that's one critique of religion, practical consequences that follow. I want to jump now to the 1820s and 1830s. Still in France, we're talking about the period of the Restoration, July monarchy, basically a period of constitutional monarchy in which the right was trying to return to the social religious conditions of the old regime where liberals were trying to protect and extend the liberties won in the revolution. Period of contestation. On the left, the left takes the form of liberalism, not liberalism in the 20th century sense. Liberal was kind of a blanket term for quite a range of positions between, on the one hand, ultra reaction and Jacobin terror, associated with the terror and therefore unacceptable. Religion remains central to liberal thought at this time because the status of the Catholic Church is still very much a live issue. So religion matters very much to the political and social debates. So the liberal I'm going to talk about, compared to many others, I'm going to talk about Benjamin Constant. Many of you may know Benjamin Constant. He's certainly best known for his treatise on liberty of the ancients compared with that of the moderns. We have reason to talk about that later on in our discussion. He's also the man who invented the term reaction as a term for the political right. Like the radical Enlightenment, Constant asks, why is there religion? Why does religion exist? But his solution, his answer was very different from the radical Enlightenment. The human condition, according to Constant, is to be torn between our finite being and our consciousness of a spiritual realm beyond the physical realm. We yearn for the infinite. This is also the romantic period, right? We yearn for the infinite simply by the fact that we're human beings. And the religions of the world are expressions of this yearning. As such, for Constant, religion is not illusion, not irrationality. It belongs to another faculty altogether, what Constant calls religious sentiment. We have reason, but we also have religious sentiment. And Constant describes religious sentiment as a voice that cries out from the depths of one's being and speaks to us of the invisible powers beyond the material world. And he calls religious sentiment an essential attribute or inherent disposition of human beings. So because he regards religious sentiment as innate to human nature, Constant rejects the central tenet of the Enlightenment critique of religion as something unnatural to humanity that comes into being at a certain moment in history and therefore can be eliminated from history. But he does accept that some forms of religion become obsolete as humanity develops over time. Early forms of religion, he says, were dogmatic, hierarchical, dominated by priesthoods. But as humanity progresses from inequality towards equality, from submission to dogma to interior spiritual liberty, and Constant thinks that providence guides and directs this historical progression. As this historical progression plays out, new forms of religion that emerge that reflect this directionality of history. So for Constant, modern religions will be proportionate to the stage of civilization reached. That is, they should be subjective, non-dogmatic, moral. In other words, religion should be private. Important modern idea. So Constant draws two political lessons from his conceptualization of religion of modern religion as private. First, the church must not be allowed to influence the state or society. So Constant is not anti-religious, but he is anti-clerical. Very useful distinction. Second, governments must not interfere in religion, either to support it or to suppress it. Now, there are other thinkers in the 1830s and 1840s in France and elsewhere who incorporated a positive view of religion into their emancipatory programs. Unfortunately, no time to talk about them. I could talk about Queen in the I've done a renowned course, but we won't do that. But as you know, in the 1840s, the situation changes. The influence of Marx returns the left to the Epicurean framework. In other words, Marx, who in fact wrote his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus, reinstated the conviction that the struggle against metaphysical illusion is integral to the struggle against oppression. Only materialist philosophy of both nature and society can free humanity from rationalism and injustice. So Constant liberalism by no means represent the end of the historical development of the conceptualization of religion. Constant's theory of religion as private contains internal flaws, and particularly the key role it gives to the theological notion of providence. And from the empirical side, religion in the modern world refuses to remain private. Outside the modern world, it never was private. So to keep on thinking about religion. So the critique of religion continues. Scholars today continue to develop theories about the nature and function of religion. What's more, not all materialist theories imply that religion will disappear. One of the most intriguing contemporary developments in critical thinking about religion comes from cognitive science. Very briefly, cognitive scientists argue that first, human minds are the product of long haphazard evolutionary history of our species, and second, that our human minds find it very easy to think religiously about the world, and very difficult, very hard, to think non-religiously about the world. In other words, secularism and science are unnatural, and therefore difficult. Religion, conversely, is natural, and therefore easy. This conceptualization of religion offers a materialist explanation of the existence, persistence, and mass appeal of religion, and suggests that religion will always be with us. So to sum up so far, for the Enlightenment and its intellectual layers, religion is illusory and unnatural. For Constant and the liberal tradition, religion points to an ontological reality and is natural. For the cognitive scientists, religion is illusory but natural. Interesting. So my intent is not to side with Constant or Marx, or for that matter, the cognitive scientists, but to point out that how the left conceptualizes religion conditions its response to it. History, that is, doesn't show us how the left today should respond to religion. Instead, history shows that how the left responds to religion depends on how it conceptualizes religion. One might dissent from Marx's critique of religion, but he was surely right about the need for a critique of religion. But, and finally, I doubt very much that any one monolithic critique of religion will suffice today. Radical historicity means there is no all-encompassing grand narrative about religion. What we think of as religion covers an enormous diversity of representations and practices that relate in widely varying ways to political and economic structures. Some are deeply conservative, deeply oppressive. Others may be psychologically or even socially liberating. Perhaps the most basic question we can ask about the left and religion, and the question I'll leave you with, is to what extent is liberation from metaphysical illusion necessary to the attainment of the left's political goals?
Thank you very much. Yes.
I'm not as tall as you know. I'm great.
Looks risky.
I'm a preacher of the United Church tradition and a politician of the NDP tradition, which means that I am primarily a propagandist. And the foundation from which I am a propagandist is the tradition of socialist Christianity. I think if I were to characterize socialist Christianity, I would say just in the most general way, what I mean by that is the vision which identifies capitalism as a principle defining impediment to the progress of the species towards the egalitarian goal, which is, in the Christian socialist tradition, God ordained. So from this foundation, if I have anything to contribute to this important conversation about faith and the left, I guess it would probably come just from my, as they say, lived experience. So I want, from my experience, just to register a couple of thoughts. There, I'll plant myself first. About one thought about something it seems to me that the tradition of faith has to offer, show / teach the left in general, and a second thought about something it seems to me the tradition of faith has to offer / teach, show to social democracy in particular. And thirdly, since we're here to think about these subjects, I wonder if you let me squeeze in a little at the end, just a little theology about Christianity and Marxism, just for a few seconds. Anthony, I can just stick this up so I can see it. Thanks. First, something I think that the biblical tradition of faith and the New Testament tradition from which I come, that I think it has to offer and to show to the left in this period is something here. I'm paraphrasing the great Marxist Christian theologian Ernst Bloch in calling this the tenacity of hope. And what I mean by the tenacity of hope is, you know, in that long period of the post-war economic expansion, in the latter section of which, especially when people of my age were young, in the 60s and the early 70s, I mean, the world really seemed as though it was on some kind of a unilateral, wonderful, onward and upward movement towards greater and greater egalitarian accomplishments. And then with the, 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan came the neoliberal ice age, and the picture for the left changed so entirely. So many things that we had taken for granted about, the existence of the left ground to a smashing halt in a short time. Reflecting about this in the late 80s, there's an American writer named Sharon Welch who tells about how she was involved at that time. She's a theologian. She tells about how she was involved in the disarmament movement in the southern states, and about how this was a big movement in the early 80s and the mid 80s. But then, as the neoliberal ice age deepened in the late 80s, and the left crumbled, there were fewer and fewer people at the meetings of the disarmament movement that she was going to, until one night she looked around and she realized that there was no one in these meetings anymore other than those who had come from, in fact, the African American church. So she had to ask herself, well, what is it in the structure of the motivation of this group of people which somehow has made it possible for them to hang in with this, where it has not been possible for others of my friends in the left. And one of the things that she concluded about this, as she reflected on it, was, if you are really steeped in that biblical tradition of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, book of Exodus, and the foundational narrative there of the this lost group of Hebrew slaves with zero democratic skills, who the Creator decides to make the subject of the human story, and go through all these decades of trials in the wilderness. If you are really steeped in this tradition, then a decade or two of loss doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. Because from the point of view of this tradition, you're not thinking about round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the fight. You're thinking about the struggle overall. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why the Christian social justice movement is a larger component of the left now than it was a number of years ago, and is a part of the left that has in fact hung in there through this 3.5 decades of the neoliberal ice age. One of the reasons is this tenacity of hope, which is in fact a dimension of the tradition of faith, which I think it really has to offer to the left. That's one thing. The second thing, it seems to me, that the tradition of biblical faith has to offer, in particular to the social democratic part of the left, I think, is the great important gift of vision. People talk a lot about the radicalism of Tommy Douglas. But Tommy Douglas, in fact, in his time, was quite regularly criticized by the left of the CCF and the left of the early NDP for being too centrist, too incrementalist, too pragmatic. But the difference between Tommy Douglas and the centrist, pragmatic, incrementalist social democratic left that we have largely now is that Tommy Douglas's view was always rooted, never separated from a vision. And in his case, it was this the egalitarian vision which comes out of the New Testament, of what he called, quoting the scripture, the New Jerusalem, the new heaven and the new earth, this biblical vision of a place where when humanity gets to a point of equality, in fact, a new order of reality emerges. Well, I would say that one of the things that makes the party that I'm a part of, the NDP, less interesting than it ought to be, one of the things that has made social democratic electoral politics less compelling in the present era than they ought to be, is the absence of this kind of a deeply rooted, overarching, egalitarian vision. I mean, after all, social democracy without an overarching egalitarian vision is really just liberalism dressed up for dinner. And so I think that the tradition of faith, which is at its core composed of vision, it has this very important thing, vision, to offer to the social democratic electoral part of the left. So there's those two thoughts, and one final thought about Christianity and Marxism. Certainly thought about in a theological way. It's important to recognize how deeply in unity and harmony at the level of vision Christianity and Marxism really are. Now, as soon as you say this, you have to be really clear about what Christianity is not. And what Christianity is not is about the salvation of individual souls. That's kind of step one. The idea that Christianity is about the salvation of individual souls is a heretical, individualist distortion. We just need to set that to one side. But once we get that to set to one side, then we say, well, what is it about? What it is about is the fundamental transformation of reality. It is about a new reality which the biblical tradition calls the realm of God. The realm of God being an order of reality that we come to in the biblical vision, where in a world based on equality and justice, nothing less than the overcoming of time and death is what is introduced. So anybody that understands Marxism can't legitimately think of Marxism as being antithetical to this foundational realm of God Christian vision. As I understand the Marxist tradition, at its core is dialectical and historical materialism, which at its core is the idea that matter has this fundamental processual emerging character. And the way that Marx so brilliantly characterized this emerging character of reality was to speak of it as the transition from what he called the realm of necessity, roughly meaning class society, to the realm of freedom, a new order of social reality that Marx envisioned, which he felt would be the true beginning of the human story. So there is nothing in the dialectical materialist view that militates against or in any way precludes what is, in fact, as I understand it, the radical, revolutionary core of the biblical vision, namely that when we get ourselves to a place of an equal and just society, we in fact will be at a threshold from which will be envisionable what the old hymn calls a situation where time will be no more. So those are the three thoughts I wanted to register with you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Antoni's already introduced me, but I think I'd like to situate myself a little further. As Antoni mentioned, I'm a member of an organization called STAND, and STAND is Marxist, but not Leninist, and also has deep anarchist sympathies. So that perhaps situates me with respect to the term the left. As for religion, I was raised in a devoutly Roman Catholic household, but at the age of 12 decided that I was agnostic, although that didn't actually prevent me in my teen years from being part of a Christian youth ministry and also a Sunday school teacher. But, but at the age of 20, I decided that atheist was probably a more accurate description of my views on religion, and since then I haven't had any sort of affiliation to religion. As for the terms themselves, the way that I'm speaking of religion here is of any spiritual belief or practice. And left, I think I would define in terms that are fairly similar to those that Gary used. I would say that well, historically, as probably most of you know, the term arose from a description of the seating arrangements in the French National Assembly of 1789, just prior to the revolution itself. And the radicals sat on the left of the speaker. And so ever since that time, typically left has been taken to mean those who oppose the established order. Initially, as Arthur was saying, that was sort of radical republicanism as opposed to monarchical ideas. And gradually, beginning with the early 19th century, it was extended to the socioeconomic realm. And so it's only in recent decades, and even then, mostly within the Anglosphere, that is English-speaking countries, that left has become this sort of amorphous category that, well, again, this is the point that Arthur made, that is often equated with liberal, which is not historically accurate at all. I found Arthur's description of the three particular ways of looking at religion is very helpful, and curiously enough, I would situate Marx amongst those who thought that religion was illusory in the sense that he didn't believe in God, but also as being natural. Now, if there's one thing that anyone knows about Marx's view on religion, he said that it's the opiate of the masses, and that's understood to mean that he thought that it was basically a plot by the ruling classes to trick the workers into accepting their lot. But that's not actually what he meant at all. The exact quotation, which is from his introduction to a paper that he called A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, and it was part of the so-called economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, is as follows. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So in other words, what he was saying is, again, coming back to the terms that Arthur was discussing, he was saying that it was a very natural and humane response to inhumane conditions. And in much the way that Gary has outlined, his response was to say that what needed to change was the material conditions in the world, which I take it on Gary's description of Christianity is not a point that Christians would necessarily take exception to. Antoni mentioned that the panelists were given a list of 6 questions to look at, and we were asked to select 1 or 2 to focus on. The 2 that I decided to single out are as follows. The first is a sort of prefatory statement. The political and personal liquidation of the secular left in many parts of the Third World during the terminal decades of the Cold War occurred alongside the gradual shifting of responsibility for social welfare provision from the state to organizations within civil society, often religious, in the First World. Have these global shifts demanded something new from the left vis-a-vis religion? And if so, what? If not, why not? More generally, is there a relationship between the death of the left and the revitalization of religion? So that's actually one question. Well, we're told that they're lengthy. And the second is, to what degree can or should or must the left today cede organizational grounds for religion? How ought those on the left distinguish between tactical cooperation and tailism vis-a-vis religion? So, first of all, I accept that it's an accurate characterization to say that the left has certainly been set back on its haunches while apparently religion has made inroads. One can see this internationally. In India, for example, which from the time of independence up until about 15 years ago was almost always ruled by the Congress Party, which was seen as center-left and used what it construed as socialist planning and the structuring of its economy, has in the past 15 years come to be a two-party process with the Bahadri Janata Party coming, actually holding the balance of power at times. And this party is so far to the right that the Narendra Modi, who was the chief minister of the state of Gujarat in the year 2000, was implicated in a pogrom in which about 2,000 Muslims were killed at the instance of supporters of the BJP, and about 10,000 made homeless. To this day, not only has Modi not been charged with any crime, he's actually now vying to become the prime ministerial candidate for the BJP in the next general election in India. And the BJP has made its platform so-called Hindutva. So, I mean, it would be essentially similar to Stephen Harper running on a Christianist campaign, shall we say, in Canada. You can look at the United States. In 1877, the first general strike in the United States took place in St. Louis. And yet, nowadays, what's the heartland of Tea Party Republicans? Missouri, Kansas, other Midwestern states. And Israel, at the time of its founding, up until the 1980s, was dominated predominantly by two institutions, the Labor Party, which was a left-wing formation, and the Institute, the Trade Union Confederation, which was also socialist in its orientation. But since that time, the Likud Party, which initially was seen as a fringe group on the very far right, has come to hold power and dominate politics. And even ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties are now quite powerful in the Knesset and frequently hold the balance of power. You can look at Europe, where openly fascist parties like, well, Antoni spoke of Syriza in Greece, but unfortunately in the most recent round of elections, another party that made a lot of headway was Golden Dawn, which is an explicitly fascist party, and like many of the resurgent fascist parties in Europe, drapes itself not only in nationalist clothing, but also often uses religious symbolism as a way of promoting itself. One sees the same sort of thing with the Jobbik Party in Hungary, for example. And I could go on there. One sees much the same situation throughout the world. So it certainly does seem that there's been this shift with the left in retreat and religion in the ascendant. So the first thing that we need to ask, I guess, is how did this come about? One way was, as mentioned in the preamble to the question, often the physical elimination of leftists. So, for example, Indonesia, which during its independence, after originally gained independence for the Dutch, was a moderate centrist state, and its president, Sukarno, was actually the person that founded the non-aligned movement at the Bandung Conference in the 1950s. But by the late 1960s, there was a coup, and when Suharto came to power, he slaughtered upwards of 1 million communist sympathizers at the behest of the United States Central Intelligence Agency. And so, naturally, with that kind of slaughter, there simply hasn't been the kind of infrastructure that would be needed within the country. One can look at Palestine. Originally, much of the Palestinian resistance was on the left, whether it was the Palestine Liberation Organization itself, or even explicitly Marxist groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But while the Israeli state expended all possible energies on dealing with those threats, even to the extent of invading its sovereign neighbor, Lebanon, in the 1980s in order to eliminate the PLO headquarters in Beirut, they actually fostered so-called Islamist groups. And what now is known as Hamas was originally a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in the early 1980s, the leader of what was still then the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, in Gaza, I should say more specifically, was arrested by Israeli forces who had discovered that he had an arms cache. But he was released without charge when he explained that he didn't have the weapons to fight the Israelis, but instead to fight secular Palestinians. And of course, the result of that has been that now Fatah has been greatly weakened by the inroads of the Israeli state, and of course has collapsed under its own corruption as well. But this wasn't something that happened organically. It took place in large part because, again, Israel spent all of its efforts on destroying the leftist Palestinian insurgencies while actively cooperating with Islamist elements, which even at the time Israel recognized as incipiently insurrectionary, but they decided that that was the lesser evil and that they could use them as instrumental allies. Another way that the setback has occurred in different polities, for example, the United States, by persecution of leftists, where typically it hasn't been so much that individuals have been killed outright, but have been arrested or harassed in various ways, and that's a long process that began nearly 100 years ago with the Palmer raids immediately after World War I that destroyed, for all intents and purposes, the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, and continued on through the Red Scare of the 1920s. It abated somewhat during the 1930s and 40s, particularly during the Second World War, when the U.S. was allied with the Soviet Union, and so had to ease off a bit. But after the war, of course, there was the emergence of McCarthyism, which effectively destroyed the most radical leftist organization in the United States. And then, well, I've already mentioned how the Israeli state supported Islamist groups as allies against leftist insurgency. That's a policy that's been followed in many countries. For example, the Kurdish Workers' Party was a democratic socialist formation, and initially it was probably the most powerful element within the Kurdish resistance. But it was systematically beaten down, particularly by Turkey, but also by Syria and Iraq, which are historic Kurdistan is a region that encompasses all three of those countries. And at the same time, notably since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the establishment of an effectively autonomous Kurdish zone in the north, what has happened is that there's been systematic support from Western powers for the elements of the Kurdish national movement that are not democratic or socialist. One can see this happening again and again in different countries. Essentially, whenever there's an option, the Western powers will always choose to support the non-leftist one. So, if that's how it happened, the question becomes: is there anything that can be done about that, or is this situation irreversible? Well, I'd say that first of all, we have to be cognizant that the situation isn't always as it seems. For example, I mentioned the case of the United States and how it's a region that during the late 19th century was a hotbed of populism is now consistently an area that votes Republican. But the situation needs to be examined more closely because, in fact, contrary to popular perception, the Tea Party is not a popular movement. It's not a movement of the masses or of the working classes. In fact, the average Tea Party member has both higher educational attainments and higher income than the average American. So I would suggest what we're seeing there is actually the effect of the two-party political system in the United States and a recognition on the part of the working class that the Democrats in office have no better record than the Republicans, at least since the neoliberal turn that Gary referred to. And therefore, what they're doing typically is simply not voting. But clearly that's quite a different matter than saying that they've decided to align their interests with those of the evangelical Christian Tea Party. It's also the case that we've seen that in certain parts of the world where perhaps one might least have expected there to be a resurgence, that's exactly what's happened. The most obvious case clearly is Latin America, where during the 1960s and 70s and 80s, virtually every state was taken over by some form of military dictatorship, and there was even an organized program known as Operation Condor that was orchestrated from Washington, involved most of the major South American states such as Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay in systematically eliminating leftists, not only those who still remained within their countries, but even tracking them down and assassinating them abroad. And yet, we have a situation where currently the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, is someone who was a Marxist urban guerrilla in the 1960s and was arrested and tortured by the military dictatorship. Now, I wouldn't suggest that the Workers' Party, which is the formation that Rousseff leads, is working very hard to eliminate capitalism and institute socialism, but nonetheless, certainly she identifies strongly with the left and has given material support to other leftist initiatives within the continent. The Bolivarian Revolution to consider in Venezuela. One can look at Bolivia or Ecuador.
Antoni, can we? I just want to try and get us the Katie. Is that can you wrap? We'll have to sort of build those into your comments. Yeah, go ahead. So wrap up.
Sorry.
No problem.
I have a clock here, but obviously I haven't been monitoring. Well, so there's that, but briefly what I would say is that I think that the principal answer lies in the left not relying on established institutions, particularly those of the state or of trade unions. I think that what is necessary to progress is to organize at a much smaller organic level, and in particular by trying to meet people's vital everyday needs. In Capital, Marx talks about the struggle for the 10-hour working day. Keep in mind that was 10 hours, 6 days a week. And he says that the importance in it lies, well, there are two reasons. One is that simply it gives people enough time and energy that they can devote their lives to something else than working, which is important. But also, he says it's simply a way for building solidarity. And one of the most fundamental concepts in Marxism is praxis, that is, reflexive self-change through political action. And I think that if that's a focus, then the question of for or against the left rapidly becomes illusory. I think that, for or against religion rapidly becomes illusory. That it's certainly possible to proceed in that way, regardless of whether one considers one a religious person or not.
Everyone here is smarter than me.
No.
All right. I just want to touch on a couple things that have already been discussed. Arthur, you mentioned this sort of similar idea to Antoni, this idea that for or against religion is sort of an unnecessary question. And I think that's pretty interesting. That's kind of what I'm going to be talking about as well. But one thing I thought was interesting that you said, Arthur, was that it doesn't really matter. What was your line about metaphysical illusion? I'm not sure I have it exactly.
Yeah, I suppose whether it's necessary to combat metaphysical illusion in order to achieve political goals.
Yes, yes. Okay, I thought that was really interesting because I think that's a mistake that is often made within the secularist left, this discussion about metaphysical illusion. So, to start, if we're going to ask whether religion and the left are compatible, obviously we have to ask what is religion and what is the left. And for the sake of this discussion, I'm assuming that religion means this sort of Abrahamic religion collection, most specifically Christianity, often also Islam. When it's convenient, a sort of like misunderstood version of Judaism that sort of calls Reform Judaism an outlier and Orthodox Judaism like normal, real Judaism. Not that it's okay. No, I didn't mean to put normal in quotation marks like that. But that puts Reform Judaism as an outlier and Orthodox Judaism in the center. So I actually propose that religion at its most broad could be defined as a particular combination of myth or story, you could go with story, community, and practice. And all of these three sort of serving to perpetuate or enforce in the person who's experiencing religion this idea that a better world is possible. Right? So that could be Marxism. It could be certain kinds of anarchism or Buddhism or any number of institutional faiths that we already think of as religion. But I obviously can't talk about all those things within this time frame. So I'm going to be limiting discussion to one that plays along with that sort of secularist left discussion of religion as Christianity. I'll talk about Christianity, mostly someone who comes from the United Church and a little bit of the Catholic tradition, so focusing on that and the left, while also referencing a couple Jewish thinkers as I go. So for now, we've limited our definition of religion, and so now I want to ask, what is the left? And you mentioned that the left in North America is amorphous, and that is not the case everywhere. And so I would like to discuss religion, the left in North America, which is amorphous, though I can't really talk to the rest of the world. Is the left a critique of contemporary capitalism? In that case, Christianity, Judaism, and the left have shown themselves so far to already be deeply compatible. I point to thinkers like Terry Eagleton, or Cornel West, or Walter Benjamin, or in some ways even Marx himself, right? Religion isn't just compatible with the left. Religion is in fact a major background force guiding these thinkers and motivating them to shape their critiques, either through their own personal faith or through their historical experience. Mysticism, faith in a greater force guiding our interactions, commitment to strive for a better world. As Gary already pointed out, those sort of religious stories are very much pervasive threads through much of the left's discussion. I'm sort of also driven to think of more revolutionary leftists, like the Marxists who speak of this idea of when the revolution comes, And if you ask them okay, so when's this revolution going to come? Because I want to make sure I take out my mutual funds in exchange for some canned food. They're like, well, we know not the time or place. That's a very religious ideal, and it's something that was brought to the left and maintained by religious thinkers who are doing that critiquing work. So is the left a resistance against state authoritarianism? In that case, Christianity can be very compatible with the left, and in fact has been much of the left in North America. I'm thinking of the roles that churches have played in refusing to bend to the whims of the state regarding undocumented immigrants. By acting as a sanctuary, and that sort of becomes a way in which churches become this outlier and space where state power can be challenged. Is the left a pilot project? What if the left is more than just this critique, but what if it's actually a community or a place where alternative social norms, substitutes for the post-war model of suburban isolation, substitutes for the nuclear family, substitutes for our obsessive focus on wealth accumulation can intentionally be explored? Again, in that case, I would say that Christianity is a birthplace of some really great models of leftness that have been happening throughout the 20th century and also right now. So I have in mind Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker Movement, which was founded in 1933, which I'm not sure drives exactly with the platypus brief that sort of describes the 20th century left as secularist, but she was an anarchist, communitarian, and not a communist, but potato, potato. So today we're seeing communities like Dorothy Day's continuing. We've got actually a branch of evangelical Christianity, the sort of Christianity that we generally see as very reactionary, forming these movements called New Monasticism, where groups like the Simple Way in Philadelphia or the Jeremiah Project in Toronto separate from those traditional ideas of what Christianity looks like and choose to live intentionally in solidarity with communities that are marginalized. They're not just critiquing capitalism, they're actually providing models of what life can look like outside of capitalism, which sounds really lefty to me. Really lefty. Yeah. This one, I don't know. I was going to say also that the left can be is a place of self-critique and exploring identity politics outside of class, you know, reflecting on how to correct its own errors. And I was going to talk about ways in which Christianity and other religions have done that. But that is a little bit, I mean, okay, so I'm coming from the United Church background, where I feel like the United Church has done a lot of that work really well. But also, I'm coming from a Catholic background where we're about to elect a new pope. So I just, it's like yes and no. Christianity is not doing that. So we're just going to keep on moving. But what if all of this is moot because none of the definitions I suggested are the North American left? What if the left today is just this fading photograph of a past that is no longer with us? What if the left in North America is a sort of Western exotification of a historical unknown? In Germany, they have a word Nostalgie, you know, like a memory for the DDR, and, you know, oh, that's a sweet couch, you know, oh yeah, those clothes from the DDR are awesome. And I'm wondering if this sort of our own growing nostalgia for a time of state capitalism is just that kind of hipster moment of enjoying something that's trendy. And if that's the case, then our question needs to shift from whether the left should or should not embrace religion to why it is that progressive religion needs to take the left seriously. To conclude, I think that maybe a better point than points I've made was made by my friend Chris Parsons, who I don't know if he's here today, actually. Okay. Well, he just said really simply that religion is a thing that people do. You know, many people base their lives around this combination of myth, community, and practice. They make decisions about what they're going to eat. They have church dinners. They babysit each other's dogs. Christianity and other religions are real organizational forces guiding people's lives. The left, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have its proverbial shit together in this way. More often, it kind of gets bogged down in its own sectarianism. The left looks very much like a bunch of individuals who have their own perspectives, which can be great, but it's hard to see what it is doing as a collective. So I would like to just end with a quotation from an atheist and interfaith activist named Chris Stedman, who is a community organizer and humanist chaplain, actually, in Boston. Stedman spoke to me in an interview with United Church Observer regarding the new atheists' obsession with eradicating religion, and he said, quote, "I don't think it's a realistic goal, and I also think it's an alienating goal. The problems we're really trying to address, those are goals we can work with religious people on. But if we exclude religious people by saying, actually, our goal is to get rid of religion, then we're not going to have the necessary number of people, the buy-in to accomplish these goals," end quote. In other words, perhaps the real question is not whether the left should be for or against religion. Rather, I would like to pose these two questions to religious people and our communities. First of all, to the left, I would like to ask, how would you like to encourage religious people to be on board? And to religious folks, I would like to ask, should we or should we not take the time away from pursuing our own revolutionary agenda to assist this ephemeral left that is not quite sure whether we should exist?
So we've got an hour left, and we'll take questions. I'm just going to repose one of the questions I didn't think was, it seems to be part of this conversation but wasn't taken up. But then I'll take two more questions and we'll get the panel to respond to all three of those questions. So the one question that was posed is, and it's interesting in sort of thinking about, you know, these shifts in terms of like these private spheres, that's the way in which atheism and religion seems to shift in the way that Arthur registered in his talk, but also the way this whole problem seems to have like its changing character under capitalism. So in some ways it seemed at times religion would be posed as outside of capitalism. It would be this community or space or practice that sat outside. And the question, I think, tries to get at the question of how maybe both the left and religion are manifestations of the dynamic of capitalism, but to what extent are they adequate responses that can move it along? And so the question goes like this. Is capitalist society generative of religious organizations as a mass phenomena in the same way that it's generative of left political organizations as a once mass phenomena? More broadly, what are the implications for the left? What implications for the left follow from your understanding of religion as a mass social phenomena within capitalism? And I think something Antoni brought up about, with Marx is like natural response. But I think I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about natural and adequate responses, because clearly, as you went on in your talk, some of these responses were natural, Hamas, but it was unclear where that would lead. And so, I'd like to hear a little bit of adequate versus natural, and sort of how do we adjudicate those things. But I also would like to take 2 questions from the floor as well to sort of put into the mix. Does anybody have some questions that they would? Gabriel.
Is secularism a necessary foundation of leftism? Of leftist thought? Yeah.
Secularism, necessary foundation, okay. And is there anybody else have a burning question they'd like to?
Or can there exist progressive movements that are not secularist, or that are that the goal they strive to achieve is not secular?
Okay. Oh, please.
Does the right's sort of more general, wholehearted acceptance of religion make it politically more powerful? Might not be the right word, but efficient.
Okay, so should the left, what is the relationship between capitalism and both religion and the left, and how are they the same or different? Secularism, must it be a necessary foundation of the left? And does the incorporation of religion into the right make it more powerful? Anybody like to?
I touched on this to a certain extent in my comments, though I guess I didn't draw it out sufficiently. Antoni just now mentioned that one of the questions pertained to this matter of religion as a mass phenomenon in a way that say the labor movement was at one time. And in fact, that was one of the ideas that I wanted to communicate, was that I don't really accept that the apparent resurgence in religion globally is a mass phenomenon in the same way, in the sense that obviously by its very nature the labor movement of the 19th and 20th centuries was adversarial. It was challenging the elite structures of society and trying to bring about a more egalitarian order. That being the case, obviously, it would have been counterintuitive to expect that any sort of elite structures or mechanisms would have supported these movements. Instead, all of this had to happen in the face of the resistance from the elites. Whereas typically, if you look around the world at politically powerful religious movements like, say, Hindutva in India, what you see, in fact, is that these are not organic movements at all. They're not. It wasn't the case that, say, the lower castes in India decided that they wanted to manifest their loyalty to their faith. In fact, quite the opposite. Hindutva is desperately discriminatory against the lower castes. It's wherever the BJP is in power, for example, it's Dalit women, untouchable women, are gang raped with impunity. We all know about the horrible incident in Delhi the other month. But in the Indian state of Haryana, in September of 2012, 19 Dalit women were gang raped, one by a dozen men who videotaped the incident and then freely circulated it on the internet, right? That's the impunity that they understood they had. So I think it's important to understand that, again, this is not an organic outgrowth, and I think the only way it can be combated, and to say a little more on that, so the point is, I think that the kind of religious impulse that Marx was talking about as being natural, in Arthur's terms, was something quite different. He didn't mean simply a chauvinistic affiliation to some sort of cultural construct or what have you. What he was talking about was a response to, as he put it, real suffering in the world. And clearly movements like, say, Hindutva or most of the Islamist movements or whatever, are quite the opposite, right? They want to increase suffering in the world by and large, and increase disparities and so on and so forth. So, but that doesn't mean that all religion is like that. Far from it. Katie has talked about some examples that are of a different nature, and so has Gary. So I think the way out of it is for leftist activists to, I think Katie made a good point when she was talking about this sort of triad here, and it's true that one of the potential downfalls on the left is that there may not be an attempt to satisfy people's emotional needs in quite the same way, and I would suggest that the way to do that is not to emphasize the myth side, certainly, we want to see that, but the other aspects, and if instead one took a leaf from, there are any number of historical examples, but two that come to mind are the Black Panther Party came to prominence partly, of course, because it showed armed resistance to the U.S. state and its discriminatory practices against African Americans. But actually, what was considered its really lasting legacy was its breakfast program, its preschool breakfast program, where kids who otherwise would have had to have attended classes malnourished were being fed. And that, both again in the way that I talked about earlier, built the movement and satisfied people's real needs and built this community that Katie was referring to. And I think that's the only way to combat these incursions from the religious right, is to say, never mind supporting all these chauvinistic ideas. Let's concentrate on that impulse to deal with real suffering in the world.
You mentioned that you would like to not focus so much on the myth and focus on community and practice. But don't you feel like people need stories or shared narratives to work collectively?
Possibly, but I don't think that, first of all, myth, of course, by its very nature, has the connotation of irreality, and so I think it's tricky enough when religion emphasizes myth, but at least presumably it can perhaps do so in good faith. I don't really see how a secular movement could do that, but if by myth, actually what you're talking about is narrative coherence or what have you, then that would be a different matter.
Gary, Arthur, did you want to come in on that? And also, if you have just responses to one another, that's also open to you.
Yeah. Well, maybe this point about secularism. There's this atheism plus movement in the United States. I think essentially it's a movement saying, okay, traditionally, atheists has been concerned about ideas of highly critical of religion, not worried much about the sort of positive side, about social solidarity, about communalism, that kind of stuff, including social activism. So we had to bring atheists and left activists together by basically creating, pseudo-religion might be too strong, but bringing a communal element to traditional atheism. And conversely, to an example, but the idea that religion, just to an extent, may be detaching itself from the supernatural. And that's another interesting area in the more liberal reaches of religion, which is, basically, the whole paradigm begins with a very specific idea about what religion is. It's supernatural, it's biblical, all these things that follow from it. And I guess the whole point is that religion isn't static. The left changes, but so does the religion, which makes it very hard to pin down. You have a headline religion, and then it's something else. It's not supernatural anymore, or it's this or that. So I find it very difficult to make general statements about this. I can talk historically, but religion is changing, which is people are always reconceiving how they think about things, often in response to critiques from the left and from intellectual critiques of supernatural ideas and so on.
Arthur, do you think this whole thing has progressed or just stayed the same for 150 years? Has it gone?
I think it's changed. I think it's progressed. I think it's changed. So that's the whole point of historicity. Things change all the time. It's not going anywhere. There's no goal to this.
Is there something about the debates that you study in the present that just seem to be repetitive?
Not really. I don't think so. I think Constance is talking specifically about the whole point about liberty related current ages to the moderns is that in the Revolution talked about, oh, let's go back to be Romans, let's revive the ancient idea of liberty, that's going to bring us freedom and so on. And Constant's point is, well, no, modern society is not the same thing as ancient society. Property works differently. Slavery's changed. Economic conditions are different. Therefore, liberty means something different in the modern period. And he extends that same idea to talk about tolerance. Religious tolerance in the ancient world was the right of each city to worship its own gods. But in the city, you had to believe in that one God. Whereas in modern tolerance now becomes precisely private, individual. And so that's specifically responding to the early 19th century ideas. But as we move forward, we find that our governments, we sort of play lip service to the idea of religion being private and freedom of religion. But we have all kinds of questions about polygamy, about Santeria sacrificing in inner cities, about all kinds of ways we restrict religious freedom. We don't really have freedom of religion. We have a kind of negotiated settlement. And so, in fact, we have some other idea of religion. Not that religion is private, but we haven't quite named it yet. Maybe that's the whole point. If we name it, then we have to start defending it and think about it. So I think concepts of religion are constantly evolving. As political structures change, as economic structures change, people have new insights into it, new perspectives on it. But it doesn't mean it's a linear progression or that we're getting a better handle on things. It's just one thing changes, political structure changes, religion changes. Well, that's what makes it so difficult for the left. I think it's a matter of being very targeted. Specific causes engage with religion in specific ways and require specific analyses. To universalize it, I think, is very difficult.
Katie, but just Gary, did you want to pop in here?
Well, I just was going to say about this question about is secularism or even atheism a definitional, integral part of a real left? Well, obviously, I don't think so. But it was the idea that it was so. This was one of, I think, the great errors of Canadian Orthodox Marxism, as we saw it in the Communist Party of Canada for many years. Probably the greatest Christian Marxist thinker in Canadian history, who came from Halifax, Joe Wallace, gave his life to organizing within the Communist Party of Canada, was never moved to a position of any influence or authority within the CP because they never trusted him. He was a daily communicant Roman Catholic and a person who wrote and published poetry about his relationship to God, and they thought that he could not possibly be a real Marxist. But I mean, this is really contrary to, I would say, one of the core contributions of Marxism, which is that we're not really interested in belief, because belief is really is ultimately a subjective matter. What you believe or you don't believe is determined by so much of your personal experience, whether it's been positive, negative, related to the various things of religion and so on. So whether a person is a believer or not, which is often a question that comes up in atheistic discourse, I think is not a helpful question at all. That's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in is the real objective tendencies of reality and trying to understand them and how we can understand them so that we can assist their movement from capitalism to something better. That's how it kind of seems to me.
Katie?
Yeah, Arthur, I was really excited that you brought up Atheism Plus, which I followed earlier in 2012 when it sort of came as a thing that was happening. And one thing that I noticed was that those folks got trolled so hard, We talk a lot about the religious right and the threat of the religious right to the left, but I'm interested in whether you have any comments on the threat of the secularist right and what threats that could pose to the left.
I must say that's not something I know much about at all. So if you could give some names where you think of this secular right, where are you?
Sort of a new, at least in terms of like what I've been reading on the internet or in terms of comments, sort of a sense of secularists that, not all secularists, but a sort of sense that, let's see, there's some things like, for example, Greta Christina gets called all sorts of awful, like, sexist words all the time. You know, a lot of the secularist feminists out on the internet get really trashed by other secularists who are like, bringing your identity politics into this. This isn't, you know. So there is this sort of challenge where secularism, we're portraying it here as this like leftist force, but it also can be very not that as well.
Yeah, and that comes up on P.Z. Myers'
Yeah,
blog too. He talks a
totally.
lot
When he
about
talks about like barbarians,
Yeah,
I don't know if he used that word exactly, but he said some like weird thing.
Yeah, it is one of his points is exactly that atheists need to be much more socially aware that in fact a lot of it are deeply misogynist and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And part of his call is for atheism plus is precisely to try and bring that level of social engagement to this community that's been so focused on narrow intellectual interests.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take it back out to get a couple of questions, if there are any, and then I think this conversation will probably keep moving it along.
I'm really curious about what the panelists' thoughts are on liberation theology and the meaning of that, where you actually had an attempt to marry a leftist current with pretty explicitly with the church. But of course then that liberation theology movement was cast aside by the mainstream of the church, by the Vatican, as being not the real church. So you had some real tension there. But I'm really interested in what folks think about this liberation theology movement and its attempt to try and marry the two, and whether that's a good idea or whether it's even a necessary idea, or what assist it may have had in Latin America for furthering leftist movements or not. Any thoughts?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I'll throw one in as well here, because it seems like one thing that's come up is the individual versus the collective seems to come up a lot, and ways in which both the left and religion seem to fall along this dichotomy, that the left and religion would be for the collective, and that the right and the secularists would be for the individual. But there's two things that sort of came up. There's right across the panel, there's ways this is coming up, and I'd just like to hear you expand on it a little bit more. Because I think there's a way in which with Gary this is much more nuanced, and there's a way which with Arthur the way in which religion is sort of like constituted socially changes. It has this private sphere. It actually is this. Oh, that's right, Gary. You sort of brought up this issue of it becomes one thing is almost a vulgarization is it becomes a subjective personal matter, that it becomes an individual matter rather than a collective matter, and it almost seems as though there's a way in which, but I don't think, I think there's much more to it, so I'd like to hear you expand that, the left and religion is about community and collectives, and that there's a way in which what seemed to be the left a long time ago, the idea of like a private sphere that Constant says, not even the state, not even the Restoration can now take away, because now this private sphere is opened up and even tyrants will not be able to take this away. There seems to be a way in which this is, what the left might have taken for granted in the past is now kind of very murky. And I'd like to hear, so we've got two questions. One is the question of liberation theology. How do you regard liberation theology? Clearly, a left religious, and every progressive leftist, when you talk to people on the left who are involved in religion, this was the cause of the 80s. But also this question of the individual, the collective, the left, and religion and secularism.
I want to go first because I want the other panelists to tell me if I'm wrong. I'm not going to say a lot, but just in response to your comment, Asaf, I feel like liberation theology is very interesting because it seems like Catholic hierarchy really enjoys giving props to liberation theology, going through the motions of canonizing Dorothy Day, for example, as a saint, Oscar Romero, what a guy, but maybe doesn't want to do the hard work of moving that forward. So, That's all I got.
Well, I just was wanting to think more along the same line about liberation theology. It seems to me that in what you're really talking about is the progressive movement of Christian theology in the last couple of decades. And that there's really two strands to it seems to me. One is a strand which is really kind of the majority strand, which is kind of sort of the application of religion to social and political questions. So it kind of moves on an axis of, if we believe this from the traditional faith and scriptures, then we are logically required to take a social justice position in the world. So a right-wing position would be antithetical, contradictory, and so it's a kind of it's a discourse of applied ethics. I think that's the mainstream of 80s liberation theology. I think its revolutionary thrust is pretty easy for the right wing, in a way, to withstand, because it doesn't really offer any different kind of thinking about the categorical structure of what faith is. It accepts really the orthodox, essentially right-wing vision of what the categories of faith are, and says we have to apply them in such and such a way. But there is another strand of liberation theology or Marxist Christianity, which is involved not just in the application of faith to society and politics, but also a rethinking about the fundamental structure of what the categories of faith are about. This seems to me a much more revolutionary and more difficult to subsume a kind of a movement, and it's based on let's say in general the notion of Marxist Christianity that the Christian project, so to say, is not about the subjectivist project of individual souls. It is rather about the redemption of reality, the redemption of the world, and this is what the central concept of resurrection means. Well, this is a very very difficult, revolutionary approach to subsume. So just kind of in that way.
Does anybody else want to come in here on these two questions?
Your second question about left being collective and religious. I mean, this is, again, it's tricky. I mean, one of the 60s, 70s movements in study religion was Mircea Eliade, who's fortunately fading now, but was hugely, he was probably the most cited scholar of religion through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he had intimate links to Romanian fascism. This came out, later on in the 90s and so on. But his whole point was that modern people are alienated individuals and they're unhappy. And what they need to do is reconnect with the archetypes, reconnect with the what he called archaic religiosity. So then that's a good case of collectivity being on the right.
Yeah.
That individualism is a modern liberal, and his word was that was a bad word idea. So it's not collectivity in the right are not exclusive concepts there.
Good.
A strange question comes to mind, I don't know, just came out of nowhere, but I mean, if religion is what you say, Gary, and I think you're a wonderful example of what one would want it to be, but if it is, then how is it even different from Marxism, and how is it even religious, in the sense that it's a belief in getting a better world? I mean, that's where I'm kind of a little lost there.
Oh, because the Christian approach to this roots this project in the ultimacy of the life of God. That's the difference. There is, is it fair to say that the great promise of the Enlightenment, the radical promise of the Enlightenment, contained also a poison? The poison that it removed the ultimacy from the idea and the project, from any idea and any project. So that things are understood in terms of perspectives from which they come, the interests which they represent, and so on. And this, in a way, is very difficult. The religious impulse maintains ultimacy. So the radicals who think that their view and their revolutionary life project is ordained by their creator, who they're going to meet at the end of their lives, are pretty hard for industry and the ruling class to deal with.
But my question, I guess, would be, well, do you think that, therefore, it's necessary to have those kind of theological beliefs to get to that place where you think that we can get a better world, or we want to get a better world? I mean, it seems to me that you can have that. Well, it's neither here nor there. And if you look, like, you both, Kate, you both, I think, marvelous exceptions to what I would call a rule, in that most people who have this sort of religiosity can be seen to also be probably right-wing, more often than not. Not only there, of course, there's a liberation theology.
I don't have the stats, but actually I heard a rumor that United Church is the only church that's growing in Canada. Is that right?
I'd be
No,
surprised.
it is the fastest growing. There is
I put my
something
money on the conversation.
with the word and the word growing out there apparently in this country. So, like progressive Christians are a thing that are not getting smaller, maybe. I don't know.
Well, Larry's point
Maybe
is
I'm
about,
just talking out of my ass.
yeah, I think Larry's point is about interpretation, though. I mean, you can make an interpretive decision. This is how you're going to read the Bible. But there's lots of other Christians making a very different interpretive decision. And it is about individual salvation. It is about following a very specific moral code, and it is, the righteousness, of course, all those sorts of things. So it's, I mean, that's an interesting turn. Is it left-wing sensibilities lead one to interpret the Bible in this way, or is it the other way around? And I kind of suspect it's the interpretive vision you bring results in the kind of Christian you are, and then how do you engage Christians who have the opposite interpretive instincts if you're appealing to the same authority? So that's it.
Antoni and I see we've got 3 questions up there, so.
I'm not sure that it strikes me that the difference you're looking for is a salient one. One of the quotations that I prepared for this evening is, I think, very much in line with what Gary was just saying. This is also from Marx's Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, 1844. He wrote, "The philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical, abstract philanthropy, and that of communism is at once real and directly bent on action." And I think Gary's right. I mean, the emphasis has to be on the praxis, on what you're doing. And to my mind, I find it rather odd, actually, that a secularist should worry about what is in somebody else's mind in that sense. Marx, in a letter to his friend Arnold Ruga, once wrote about this meeting that he'd been at with a bunch of socialists where everyone was talking about atheism. And he said it reminded me of children trying to show you how grown up they are by talking about not being afraid of the boogeyman. I mean, his point was, who cares? Really, it's what you do. What's in your mind as to whether there's a God or not is really not that essential. Or again, sort of bookending his life. Much later, during the time of the Paris Commune, he was interviewed by a reporter from the New York World who asked him, amongst other things, about atheism. And Marx said, well, I'm an atheist myself, but the International has no position on that. Right? He was simply saying, who cares? It's a matter of private conscience. We don't need to worry about that.
Thank you. Okay, so.
I looked it up and I was totally wrong.
Okay.
Mark for 2008.
Will.
I guess this actually relates to a lot to what he was saying. In pre-capitalist societies, and of course leftism being a product of capitalist society itself, in pre-capitalist society, all labor and work was done towards the deity. You only did all your things because you believed in it. So therefore, wouldn't religion itself, this classification of religion, especially the multitude of religions available, be a direct result of global capital? And therefore, is left versus religion a false dichotomy, or is left just another one of billions of ideological things in the commodity sphere? Is this even a dichotomy worth dealing with? It seems like it's just another form of religious belief.
I agree.
Okay.
That's just a question. What do you girls thought of that? exactly.
So just if it was to paraphrase it as we come back, it seems as though that previously, maybe just rephrase it one more time because I'm not sure I quite got the.
Okay, sorry. It seems as though this left versus religion dichotomy is false, because it seems that left is another ideological belief in the grand sphere of ideological beliefs, which includes religious belief.
So it sounds like you're saying that left is just another religion.
Yeah, and I was just asking, what are y'all's thoughts on that? Does that make sense?
So that's very clear. Will and then Mark.
Yeah, so I kind of have a response to this question. You were asking, so if there's all these similarities, according to Gary, with Marxism and Christianity, so what's the difference between them at all? And the way I understand it, yeah, it's true that religion and Marxism both share this sort of very similar vision. But I think where they differ is that, Marxism, or what we might call progressive politics, thinks that it will be attained through action and through human beings' own rationality and ability and work. And I think this is where it kind of shares some assumptions with what it purports to oppose, namely technological capitalism. And I think that religion, on the other hand, sees this vision coming about. Sure, we have some work to do, but I think it also has a sense of patience in the sense that God will do something. And I think that is a much more helpful kind of stance.
But don't you think that Marxism also has this sort of rhetoric of patience within it too? Just wait, we're going to get so inundated with IKEA shit, capitalism's going to get so extreme, just 20 more minutes, just wait. And then, once, Stephen Harper just gets so conservative, people will just turn around and flip out. The revolution will come.
Yeah, there
don't
is
you
this
think
sense
that's
of
sort
necessity.
of a messianic tendency?
Yeah, maybe you're right.
Okay, and the two questions seem to have some common elements to them, so it'd be great for the panel to take it up, and Mark, I'll just...
Mine's a comment, and I have to apologize. I'm trying to think about this comment for the whole night, but because I work nights, I'm usually supposed to be sleeping right now, and my brain doesn't work right now. So if it comes out strange, I apologize. It's the idea that if you go to any right-wing, conservative, fundamental church today, there's a big push on to... I think of 3 churches in Halifax that have it's all focused about youth. It's all focused about getting youth involved in the church and getting youth involved in, and that's really, to me, I just see that getting youth involved in right-wing politics is what I see. And when I look at a lot of left, the United Church, and some other churches, it's kind of I just don't see that. I go to the United Church and I see a lot of older people. And I'm thinking to myself, I just got married, I want to have kids, I want to grow my kids in this church, but how do I, it's just not there. And so there's a danger in the present, and I think it's something real, and we on the left have to pay attention to that. And so that's the comment that I've been trying to think about, and sorry if it doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Well, what I would say is that
And Antoni, just before you get started, I think it's 1:45, so I think build in some of your closing remarks into this. We'll make this sort of the final round. Please, sorry to interrupt.
No problem. I think that this latest round of questioning needs to ask what is meant by religion, and depending on how one construes the term, I might well say that Marxism, let's say, could be defined as being synonymous with religion. Again, if we take the sort of view that Gary set out and I would suggest Marx too, as being an impulse towards dealing with the real suffering in the world, then I don't think that there's any shame in Marxism allowing that it's a religion. The difficulty is that, of course, there's a dichotomy here. All evening long, we've been talking about religion, both in that sort of progressive sense, but also religion construed as, let's say, blind adulation of tradition, the individual soteriology that Gary said was not his vision of Christianity, the kind of use of religion that I've mentioned as a justification for violent actions against other people and so on and so forth. In other words, unreflexive and plain nasty behavior. Well, okay, that's, if one construes religion in that sense, or again, if one sees it as embracing both of those divisions, then we have an issue. But if we do take, and if we say, well, no, true religion is this business of seeking to improve the human lot generally, then, as I said, I don't think that Marxism would need to be ashamed to see itself designated a religion. Keeping in mind I'm an atheist. Deism is a part of religion that keep me out of it.
The part of the difficulty in our conversation is that when we say left emerges out of capitalism, a modern phenomenon, whereas religion, of course, is vastly older and vastly more complex. I only think it really makes sense to talk about the left and specific religious movements or specific religious events, and that's a very pragmatic decision. Some are entirely compatible with the left's aims and goals and should be cooperated with. Others are deeply antithetical and should be opposed. But I think it's got to be on a case-by-case basis, and it's going to be very different when we're talking about the industrial West, if we're talking about a non-West, if we're talking about even different parts of Canada, probably. These are case-by-case decisions, I think.
I thought what you said about the United Church and the youth focus of the evangelical church was really, really clear. And if that's what you're doing, you've been up all night, wherever you are on a night's sleep, I'm going to be there taking notes. I think the difficulty is, this is not a United Church problem. This is the problem of the liberal Christian tradition, which is everywhere in the Western world in decline. The liberal Protestant Christian tradition. And I think that the core of this tradition, the problem, is that the liberal Protestant project, even though it is often very geared in a social justice way, it has a great social justice component, does great things, and emphasizes this dimension of the Christian gospel, it has fundamentally not figured out what it is about. The thing about the right-wing evangelicals is they know exactly what they're about. They have clarity in quadruple spades. This is about saving those who are not yet saved. This is nothing else. This is what it's about. The liberal Protestant project really has its roots in that idea of what Christianity is about. But it understands that something's really wrong with that. And it's kind of rooted in subjectivism. It's really screwed up about it. So they've moved away from it, and having got rid of something that was deeply problematic, they have replaced it with more or less nothing, which makes them particularly, people are unattractive because they are theologically often very unattractive, even though their politics and social components are often pretty good. So I kind of think that about it. I wanted to just say on this matter about whether you should think about Marxism as a religion. I wasn't saying that Marxism and Christianity are at all the same. Because ultimately they are about different spheres. They're about different orders of question. The Marxist project ends with the realm of freedom, the beginning of the human story. The biblical project is about something of a completely different order, which the Marxist project does not address. That is, whether or not the story of history ends with the movement to an order beyond time at which unfairness and death and brokenness are going to be overcome. I'm simply trying to say that there's no reason, based on dialectical materialism, for anyone to say that from the point of view of the realm of freedom, that is a classless society, the overcoming of exploitation, there's no reason for a Marxist who understands their own tradition to say that from that point we cannot envision the overcoming of time. That's all. So I think they're both different spheres. Religion is about the conveyor belt, the trap of time in which life is lived, and Marxism and the revolutionary spirit is about the trap of injustice and exploitation. So they where they intersect, there is this tremendous power. But that's different from saying that they're the same thing. And I would only just say last, it made me think about. I think it is that Ernst Bloch, the Marxist Christian theologian. But anyway, whoever it is, somebody said, it was pretty smart, somebody said that you really do have to be a good atheist before you can make any sense of being a good Christian. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. And Katie, you have the last word.
Ooh. Yeah, well, in that case, I'm just thinking about Gabe's question and how you never really answered it. Sorry.
I feel like I didn't clarify it very well.
All right. Well, from what I understood, you were asking whether secularism was a necessary part of the left. And I think that that's a really good time for us to end by reminding ourselves that this conversation has very much been situated in discussions about Christianity for 3 out of 4 of the people who spoke, I would say. You talked a little bit more about world religions. And so within that context, I think it's like we can sort of imagine of what other conversations could have happened if we had different religious voices here. And I would say with that in mind that my answer to you would be no. I don't think that the left can be strictly atheistic. I have in mind in Toronto recently, there was a lesbian woman who came into a Muslim barbershop and asked for a haircut. And the gentleman was like, listen, bro, I'm sorry, like, I don't cut women's hair. And then this became a human rights appeal. It is going through the courts, or she has threatened to put it through the courts at the very least. I haven't followed the story. And for me, this is one of those examples of which the left really needs to understand that for it to be successful, we need to have this sort of interfaith approach. Like, some of us aren't going to want to touch ladies' hair. You know what I mean? So I think that for the left to be truly successful, we need to have this sort of like ability to hold a variety of religions in tension with our aims. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Well, round of applause for our thanks for everybody who came out. If you're interested in getting some more information and you came in late, there's a sign-up sheet, and the platypus reviews are free to take away. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. Have a good evening.